I'm Sarah, and I spent 3 years believing I was the perfect daughter. Over all these years, I sacrificed everything, my career, my savings, my entire life, to care for our dying father, while my successful siblings lived their glamorous lives. When they showed up at his funeral demanding equal inheritance, I had a folder full of evidence ready to destroy them. But then my father's final video message played, and I realized the most dangerous person in our family story was me. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my family requires understanding the careful architecture of resentment that my father built over decades. Growing up as the middle child in the Morrison family meant existing in a perpetual state of invisibility. My older brother David was the golden son, Harvard MBA, corner office at a Fortune 500 company, the kind of success story my father would brag about at dinner parties. My younger sister Claire was the creative darling, art school graduate turned successful gallery owner in Manhattan, living the bohemian dream that secretly fascinated my traditional father. And then there was me, Sarah, the practical one, the reliable one, the one who became a nurse because someone had to be sensible, who lived 20 minutes from home because someone had to be available, who never married because somehow there was never time between everyone else's emergencies and expectations. I told myself I chose this life, but the truth was more complicated. I stayed close because I was still chasing something I'd never quite caught. My father's approval, his recognition, his love expressed in words rather than duty. When Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 72, I didn't hesitate. I took a leave of absence from the hospital where I'd worked for 15 years. I moved into the family home, the sprawling colonial where I'd grown up feeling overlooked, and I became his full-time caregiver. "You don't have to do this," he said on that first day, but his relief was evident. David was too busy with quarterly reports. Claire was preparing for a major exhibition. I was available, as always. What I didn't tell anyone, including myself initially, was that this wasn't entirely selfless. I saw an opportunity in my father's illness, a chance to finally be the daughter who mattered most, to earn the recognition that had always eluded me. If I could be indispensable during his final months, surely he would see my worth. The first few months were almost beautiful in their simplicity. Dad and I developed routines, morning medications with coffee, afternoon walks when he felt strong enough, evening conversations about his childhood stories I'd never heard before. I documented everything meticulously, partly for medical reasons, and partly because I wanted to preserve these moments I'd waited my whole life to have. My siblings called occasionally. David's conversations were efficient. Updates on Dad's condition, brief discussions of practical matters, promises to visit soon that rarely materialized. Claire was more emotional but equally absent, crying over FaceTime calls about how hard this was for her, while I held the phone with one hand and prepared Dad's medications with the other. The first deception came naturally, almost unconsciously. When my siblings asked how Dad was doing, I began editing the truth. I didn't mention the good days when he felt strong and alert. I emphasized his pain, his confusion, his deterioration. I told myself I was protecting them from false hope. But the reality was darker. I was protecting my position as the essential daughter. "Dad seems to be declining faster than expected," I'd tell David during our weekly check-ins. "The doctor says he's having more difficult days," I'd explain to Claire. It wasn't entirely false. There were difficult days. But there were also afternoons when Dad would garden with surprising energy, evenings when his mind was sharp enough for complex conversations about politics or books. I kept these moments to myself, hoarding them like precious coins. As the months progressed, I quit my job entirely. I told everyone it was temporary, that I'd return to nursing once Dad recovered, or, well, once this was over. But privately, I began to suspect I'd never go back. Caregiving had become my identity, my source of purpose and moral superiority. I was the daughter who stayed, who sacrificed, who truly loved. The isolation was profound. My social life evaporated. My savings dwindled as I covered household expenses Dad was too proud to admit he was struggling with. My own health began to suffer from the physical and emotional demands of round-the-clock care. But I endured it all because I believed in the narrative I was creating, that my sacrifice would be recognized, that my devotion would finally earn me the place in my father's heart that I'd always craved. By the second year, my siblings' visits had become increasingly rare and increasingly awkward. David would arrive with expensive gifts, a new television for Dad's room, a high-end massage chair, as if technology could substitute for presence. He'd stay for a few hours, make important phone calls in Dad's study, and leave with obvious relief. Claire's visits were dramatic productions. She'd arrive with flowers and tears, overwhelm Dad with emotional intensity, then retreat to her old bedroom to sob about how she couldn't handle seeing him this way. She'd leave within a day or two, always with some urgent professional obligation calling her back to the city. I began to resent not just their absence, but their ability to leave. They could drop in, play the concerned child for a few hours, then return to their successful, independent lives. I was trapped, though I wouldn't have admitted it then. I was committed to a role that was consuming my entire existence. The second deception was more deliberate. I began scheduling Dad's difficult treatments and doctor's appointments during times when I knew my siblings couldn't visit. I'd mention these appointments casually, knowing they couldn't rearrange important work commitments on short notice, then use their absence as evidence of their selfishness. I had to take Dad for his chemotherapy alone again. I'd mention during family phone calls, my voice carefully neutral, but my meaning clear. I started subtly discouraging their visits. When David mentioned flying in for a weekend, I'd remind him that Dad had been having particularly bad days and might not be up for company. When Claire talked about bringing her daughter to visit her grandfather, I'd express concerns about exposing a child to Dad's current condition. I convinced myself I was protecting Dad from disappointment, but I was really protecting myself from having to share him. Those conversations we had during his alert moments, those small smiles when I brought him his favorite soup, those whispered thank you moments when he was in pain and I was the only one there to help. These had become my most precious possessions. I was becoming someone I wouldn't have recognized 2 years earlier. But the transformation was so gradual, so justified by circumstance, that I couldn't see it happening. During Dad's third year of illness, as his condition genuinely began to deteriorate, he brought up the subject I'd been simultaneously dreading and anticipating: his will.
"Sarah, we need to talk about what happens to the house, to everything, when I'm gone," he said one evening as I helped him prepare for bed. My heart raced. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously working toward, the recognition of my sacrifice, the tangible proof that my devotion had been seen and valued. "Dad, we don't need to talk about that now," I said, following the script of a dutiful daughter, even as every fiber of my being screamed for him to continue. "Yes, we do," he insisted with more strength than he'd shown in weeks. "I've been thinking about this a lot. David has his career, his own wealth. Claire has her gallery, her independence. But you've given up everything for me. You've been my anchor through all of this." I felt tears forming, not just from emotion, but from vindication. Finally, someone saw my sacrifice. Finally, it was being acknowledged. "I want you to know that the house will be yours," he continued. "Most of the assets, too. You've earned it, Sarah. You've proven what family really means." I should have felt pure joy, but alongside the satisfaction was something else, a creeping awareness that I'd manipulated this outcome more than I wanted to admit. I pushed the thought away. I deserved this. I'd sacrificed everything. "Are you sure, Dad? David and Claire will understand when they see everything you've done," he finished. "I'm having the lawyer come next week to make it official." That night I lay in my childhood bedroom, listening to Dad's labored breathing through the baby monitor I'd installed, and I felt a complex mixture of triumph and unease. I'd won, but winning felt different than I'd expected. What I didn't tell Dad, what I couldn't even fully admit to myself, was that I'd been documenting more than just his medical care. I'd been keeping detailed records of my siblings' absences, their brief visits, their excuses and delays. I had a folder on my laptop labeled Family Communication that contained screenshots of text messages, records of phone calls, dates and times of visits. I told myself it was for my own emotional processing, a way to validate my feelings of abandonment and resentment. But as Dad's lawyer appointment approached, I began to realize I'd been unconsciously building a case, evidence of my siblings' neglect that could justify my inheritance if anyone questioned it. The darker truth was that I'd been engineering some of their absences. I'd scheduled important medical appointments during their planned visits. I'd exaggerated Dad's bad days to discourage them from coming. I'd created situations where they looked neglectful, then documented their failure to show up. I wasn't just the devoted caregiver. I was the architect of my siblings' apparent abandonment. When the lawyer arrived to update Dad's will, I made sure to be present, ostensibly to help Dad with any medical questions that might arise. Really, I wanted to witness the legal formalization of my victory. "Mr. Morrison wants to leave the family home and the majority of his assets to his daughter Sarah," the lawyer explained, "in recognition of the extraordinary care she's provided during his illness." I nodded solemnly, playing the role of the reluctant but deserving heir. Inside, I was celebrating. The lawyer left, and Dad seemed relieved to have handled this final responsibility. "Now I can focus on enjoying whatever time we have left," he said, squeezing my hand. That squeeze should have felt like pure love, but I couldn't shake the knowledge that I'd helped orchestrate this moment through calculated manipulation. Dad's condition worsened significantly after the will was updated, as often happens with terminal illness, as if handling his final affairs had given him permission to let go. The end came, faster than any of us expected. I called David and Claire when the hospice nurse said we were looking at days, not weeks. They both scrambled to make arrangements, to catch flights, to clear schedules. For the first time in 3 years, family felt urgent to them. David arrived first, taking a red-eye from Chicago. I watched him walk into Dad's room and saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine grief, real love, profound regret.
He sat by Dad's bedside for hours, holding his hand, apologizing for not being there more. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I thought there would be more time. I thought you'd understand that I was working so hard partly for you, to make you proud." Claire arrived the next day, and her reaction was even more devastating to witness. She collapsed beside Dad's bed, sobbing not with her usual dramatic flair, but with raw, deep anguish. "I couldn't handle seeing you sick," she confessed to our unconscious father. "I was so scared of losing you that I kept myself away. I'm so sorry. I love you so much." For the first time in 3 years, I began to question the narrative I'd built. Were my siblings truly selfish and neglectful? Or were they just flawed humans, dealing with impending loss in their own imperfect ways? Had I been the saint I believed myself to be? Or had I been something else entirely? Dad passed peacefully 2 days later, with all 3 of us present. In his final moments, surrounded by his children, there was no question of who was most loved or most deserving. There was just a family saying goodbye to their father. The funeral was everything Dad would have wanted: dignified, well-attended, full of stories about his long life and professional accomplishments. David gave a beautiful eulogy about Dad's work ethic and integrity. Claire created a photo montage that brought tears to everyone's eyes. I spoke about his courage during his illness and his gratitude for family. We looked like a family united in grief, and for a few hours, we almost were. The problems began immediately after the service, during the gathering at the family home. Relatives and friends milled through the rooms where I'd spent 3 years caring for Dad, and I felt a strange possessiveness about the space. This was my house now, legally and morally. These people were guests in my domain. David pulled me aside first. "Sarah, we need to talk about the arrangements, about the house and Dad's affairs." "What arrangements?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The house, the estate. We need to discuss how we're handling everything. I know you've been managing things and we're grateful, but we need to sit down and figure out the logistics." The word "we" sent ice through my veins. There was no "we" in Dad's will. There was me, and it were my siblings, who'd abdicated their right to make these decisions through 3 years of absence. Claire joined us, her face blotchy from crying, but her voice determined. "David's right. We need to make plans. I know this house has so many memories, but it's too big for one person, and none of us lives here anymore. We should probably put it on the market and split everything equally." "Split everything equally?" I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Well, yes," Claire said, as if this were obvious. "We're all Dad's children. We all loved him. I know you took care of him at the end, and we're so grateful for that, but what?" I interrupted. David stepped forward, sensing trouble. "Sarah, I think there might be some confusion. Dad always talked about dividing everything between the 3 of us. That's how it's always been in our family." I stared at my siblings. These people who'd built successful lives while I'd sacrificed mine, who'd been absent during Dad's suffering, but present to claim their inheritance, who assumed their blood relation entitled them to equal shares of rewards they hadn't earned. "There's no confusion," I said slowly. "Dad changed his will. The house is mine. Most of the assets are mine. This was his decision, made when he could see clearly who was actually here for him." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, funeral guests continued their conversations, oblivious to the family drama unfolding in hushed tones by the staircase. "That's impossible," David said finally. "Dad wouldn't do that. We're his children, too." "You're his children when it's convenient," I replied, years of resentment finally finding their voice. Where were you during his chemotherapy? Where were you during his midnight panic attacks? Where were you when he couldn't remember my name for 3 days straight?" Claire's face crumpled. "Sarah, that's not fair. We were dealing with this too in our own ways. We all handle grief differently." "Grief?" I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You were grieving your own discomfort. I was grieving our father every single day while keeping him alive and comfortable and loved." The conversation was attracting attention. Other family members began glancing our way, sensing conflict but not understanding its source. David's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Sarah, even if Dad did change his will, you have to see how this looks. We're family. We need to work this out fairly." "Fairly?" The word tasted bitter. "What's fair about 3 years of my life? What's fair about my career, my savings, my health, my future, all sacrificed while you two lived your lives? What's fair about being the only one who loved him enough to stay?" I was causing a scene at my father's funeral, and some distant part of me recognized this was wrong. But the larger part of me, the part that had been building toward this moment for 3 years, didn't care. "We'll contest it," Claire said suddenly, her artistic temperament flaring into defiance. "If Dad really did this, if he really cut us out, we'll fight it. It's not right, Sarah. It's not what he would have wanted if he'd been thinking clearly." "Contest it then," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to a specific folder. "But you should know what you'll be up against." I showed them my screen, just a glimpse of the hundreds of documented instances of their absence, their excuses, their failures to show up when Dad needed them. "I have 3 years of records," I said quietly. "Every missed visit, every canceled plan, every time you chose your careers over our dying father, every conversation where you couldn't even spare 10 minutes because you were too busy or too important or too fragile to deal with his reality." David's face went pale. Claire's defiance crumbled into something that looked like shame. "Sarah," David said carefully, "what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to contest Dad's will, I'll make sure everyone, the lawyers, the courts, the entire family, knows exactly what kind of children you were to him at the end. I'll make sure your absence becomes public record." It was a threat, barely veiled and completely calculated. I was leveraging their guilt and their public reputations to protect an inheritance I'd manipulated my way into receiving. In that moment, standing in the house where I'd grown up feeling invisible, surrounded by funeral guests paying respects to the father I'd monopolized in his final years, I finally saw myself clearly. I wasn't the devoted daughter I'd believed myself to be. I was something much more complicated and much less admirable. 3 days later, we gathered in Dad's lawyer's office for the formal reading of the will. David and Claire had been quiet since the funeral, processing not just their grief, but the new reality of our family dynamic. I'd been victorious, but strangely empty, like someone who'd won a game they no longer wanted to play. The lawyer confirmed what I'd already told my siblings. The house and most of Dad's assets were mine, with smaller bequests for David and Claire that felt almost dismissive in their modesty. "However," the lawyer continued, "your father also left specific instructions for me to play a video message during this reading. He recorded it shortly after updating his will, and asked that all 3 children be present to view it." My stomach dropped. I hadn't known about any video message. What could Dad have wanted to say that he hadn't already expressed through his will? The lawyer set up a tablet on his desk, and Dad's face appeared on the screen. He looked frail but alert, sitting in his favorite chair in the living room I now owned. "Hello, my children," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in his final weeks. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. And you're learning about the decisions I made regarding my estate." He paused, looking directly into the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. "David, Claire, I know you're probably hurt and confused by my choice to leave most everything to Sarah. I want you to understand that this wasn't a decision I made lightly, and it wasn't made out of anger or disappointment in either of you." I felt a flicker of relief. Dad was going to explain, to justify my inheritance, to confirm that I'd earned this recognition. "I made this choice because Sarah needed it in a way that you two don't. David, you've built a successful career and accumulated your own wealth. Claire, you've created a thriving business and established your independence. You both have full, rich lives outside of this family." The relief began to curdle into something else. "But Sarah," Dad continued, looking into the camera as if he could see me, "Sarah has spent so much of her life waiting for permission to live, waiting for recognition, for approval, for someone to tell her she matters." My hands were shaking. This wasn't the validation I'd expected. I've watched her sacrifice her own dreams and opportunities, not just during my illness, but for years before that. She stayed close to home, chose a practical career over her real interests, never married or had children, partly because she was always available for family emergencies, always ready to be needed. Dad's image shifted, leaning forward slightly. "The truth is, Sarah, I've been worried about you for a long time. Not because you aren't capable or intelligent or worthy of love. You're all of those things. But because you've been so focused on earning worth through service that you've forgotten your own inherent value." I could barely breathe. This wasn't recognition of my sacrifice. It was pity for my emptiness. "I'm leaving you the house and the assets, not as a reward for caregiving, but as a foundation for building a life of your own choosing. I hope you'll use this security to finally pursue your own happiness instead of everyone else's approval." The video continued for a few more minutes, with loving words for David and Claire, explanations of his smaller bequests to them, and expressions of pride in their independent successes. But I barely heard the rest. When the screen went dark, the lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. David and Claire were staring at me with expressions I couldn't interpret. Pity? Understanding? Something that might have been compassion? "I need some air," I said abruptly, standing and walking out of the office. I sat in my car in the lawyer's parking lot for over an hour, processing what I'd just learned. Dad hadn't left me everything because I'd been the most loving daughter. He'd left me everything because he'd seen me as the most pathetic one. The child so desperate for validation that she'd traded her entire life for the possibility of being needed. My inheritance wasn't recognition of my virtue. It was compensation for my emptiness. The worst part was that he was right. Everything he'd said about my life, my choices, my desperate need for approval, it was all accurate. I had been waiting for permission to live. I had sacrificed my dreams for the safety of being indispensable. I had chosen caring for others over caring for myself because it felt like the only way to matter. But there was something else, something Dad couldn't have known when he recorded that video.
The caregiving hadn't been entirely selfless. The documentation of my siblings' absences hadn't been innocent. The manipulation of their visits, the exaggeration of Dad's bad days, the careful construction of my role as the only devoted child, none of that had been accidental. I hadn't just sacrificed my life for Dad's care. I'd weaponized that sacrifice to claim a victory I didn't deserve.
David knocked on my car window, startling me out of my spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, can we talk?" I rolled down the window, but couldn't meet his eyes. "We heard what Dad said," he continued gently. "Claire and I have been talking, and we want you to know we're not going to contest the will." This should have been relief, but it felt like another kind of defeat. "We also want you to know that we're sorry," Claire said, appearing beside David, "not for having our own lives, but for not seeing how much you were struggling, for not recognizing that you needed support too, not just Dad." Their kindness was somehow worse than their anger would have been. It confirmed that I'd become exactly what Dad had seen, someone whose need for validation had made her pitiable rather than admirable. "I have to tell you both something," I heard myself saying, and then, sitting in that parking lot, I told them everything. The exaggerated reports of Dad's condition, the scheduled conflicts that prevented their visits, the deliberate isolation I'd created to make myself seem more essential, the documentation I'd compiled to use against them. I told them about the folder on my laptop, about the calculated way I'd built a case for my own worthiness while undermining theirs. I told them how I'd manipulated Dad's final years to serve my own psychological needs. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Why are you telling us this?" David asked finally. "Because Dad was right about me," I said. "I've been living for other people's approval for so long that I became someone I don't recognize, someone who would manipulate a dying man's relationships with his children to feel important." Claire was crying, but not with anger, with something that looked like understanding. "Sarah," she said softly, "we all did things we're not proud of during Dad's illness. I avoided him because I couldn't handle the reality of losing him. David threw money at the situation because he didn't know how else to help. You controlled the situation because it made you feel valuable. We all coped badly in our own ways." "That's not the same thing," I protested. "Isn't it?" David asked. "We all let our own needs and fears interfere with just loving Dad and each other. We all have things to be sorry for." I kept the house, but not because I felt I deserved it. I kept it because Dad was right. I needed the security to figure out who I was beyond my role as a caregiver. I also kept it because my siblings insisted, recognizing that Dad's intentions had been loving, even if his analysis had been painfully accurate. But I didn't keep the house unchanged. I donated most of Dad's belongings to charity, keeping only a few meaningful items. I converted his room into a home office. I painted walls, rearranged furniture, and slowly transformed the space from a monument to sacrifice into a foundation for something new. I also made other changes. I went back to school to pursue the degree in psychology I'd abandoned 20 years earlier to become a nurse. I started therapy to understand the patterns Dad had identified so clearly. I began volunteering with a hospice organization, offering my caregiving skills without the complicated family dynamics that had poisoned my experience with Dad. Most importantly, I began building relationships with David and Claire that weren't based on duty or guilt or competition for parental approval. We started having dinners together, sharing memories of Dad that weren't filtered through resentment or righteousness. We became siblings in a way we'd never been as children competing for attention. It took time to forgive myself for the manipulation, for the way I'd turned Dad's illness into a battleground for family supremacy. It took longer to understand that forgiveness didn't require forgetting. I needed to remember what I'd been capable of when my need for validation went unchecked. The folder on my laptop labeled Family Communication still exists, but I've never opened it since that day in the parking lot. It serves as a reminder of how carefully we can construct our own righteousness, how thoroughly we can deceive ourselves about our motivations. 6 months after Dad's death, I received a package from Claire. Inside was a painting she'd created, a portrait of our family based on a photo from my childhood. But in her artistic interpretation, none of us were looking at the camera. We were all looking past each other, each focused on something outside the frame. The accompanying note read, "I keep thinking about how we all spent so much time trying to earn love instead of just giving it. Maybe it's not too late to learn the difference." She was right. I'd spent 3 years believing I was demonstrating love through sacrifice, but really, I'd been negotiating for approval through service. The love I'd given Dad had been real, but it had been tangled up with so many other needs and wants and fears that its purity had been compromised. The inheritance that had once felt like vindication now felt like what it actually was, a generous gift from a father who'd seen his daughter's pain more clearly than she'd seen it herself. Dad hadn't rewarded my manipulation. He'd tried to heal the wounds that had made manipulation feel necessary. I think about that video message often, about Dad's expression when he talked about my life of waiting for permission. There had been sadness in his eyes, but also hope. Hope that security might give me the courage to stop performing worthiness and start experiencing it. He was right about that, too. The house became more than shelter. It became the foundation for rebuilding a life based on choice rather than obligation. The financial security allowed me to pursue education and interests I'd deferred for decades. But most importantly, the knowledge that I was loved enough to be seen clearly, even when that clarity was uncomfortable, gave me permission to start seeing myself honestly, too. Today, 5 years after Dad's death, I understand that my real inheritance wasn't the house or the money. It was the opportunity to learn the difference between being needed and being loved, between earning approval and accepting worth, between controlling relationships and participating in them. I still live in the family home, but it's truly mine now, in a way it never was when I was performing caretaker for an audience of one. David and Claire visit regularly, not out of duty, but because we've built something resembling genuine affection. We talk about Dad with warmth, rather than competition, sharing memories without keeping score. The hospice work has taught me that caregiving can be an act of pure service when it's not tangled up with personal agenda. I've sat with dying strangers and their families, offering the skills I developed during Dad's illness, but without the complicated emotional investment that had corrupted my care for him. I never did return to nursing in the traditional sense, but I found my way to a career that uses those skills. I'm a grief counselor now, helping families navigate the complex emotions and relationships that terminal illness exposes. I'm particularly effective with families where guilt and resentment have complicated the caregiving dynamic. probably because I understand from personal experience how love and manipulation can become dangerously intertwined. My own therapy continues, not because I'm broken, but because understanding myself remains an ongoing project. I've learned that the need for approval that drove my behavior with Dad didn't appear overnight. It was the result of decades of feeling invisible, of believing that love had to be earned rather than simply received. But I've also learned that understanding the source of destructive patterns doesn't excuse acting on them. I manipulated my siblings' relationships with our dying father to serve my own psychological needs, and that manipulation caused real harm to all of us. The fact that my behavior came from pain doesn't make it acceptable.